Good morning from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center. Our center is one of the leading institutes of advanced research in the humanities, as well as one of the oldest. This year we celebrate our 40th anniversary. As one does with birthdays, we did a kind of taking stock and decided to create some public programs that would address, as humanities scholars often do, both what endures in our fields and what matters in the present moment. The series that brings us here together today is part of that initiative. It's called How Change Comes, Knowledge and Justice in 2020. The series began 2 days ago with a lecture by the historian of Latin America and the Atlantic, Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra, drawing from his current research with a colleague, Adrian Masters, on how colonial archives served as a scene of struggle for conquistadors, indigenous elites, and others alongside the viceregal courts and the economy. In other words, how paper came to serve as a third currency along with persuasion and silver. As we conceived the series, this event builds on the first one. Today, Professor Cañizares reflects on the broader implications of his scholarship for the field and discusses how it is connected to his work on behalf of Latinx faculty at his home institution, the University of Texas, Austin. Today's event is called Conversations on the History of Hispanics in the US from Marginality to More Marginality, the case of Latinx faculty at the University of Texas, Austin. About a year ago, Professor Cañizares, whose groundbreaking work, past and present, proves that he knows his way around archives and bureaucracies, produced a report on the professional inequities experienced by Latinx professors. The effect of a historian turning his skills of research and analysis to his own institution were startling. He will tell us what some of those effects were, but they included very substantial raises in salary for Hispanic faculty and the establishment of an equity committee headed by Hispanic deans and advised by Hispanic faculty. Now, before we get into the conversation, let's take care of a few matters of procedure. Today's conversation is being recorded and will be posted to our website in a few days. Obviously, we want the audience to join the conversation even within the webinar format, and today we're going to try something new. As always, you may submit questions anytime during the event via the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will convey them to Professor Cañizares. However, if you want to ask your question in your own voice, indicate that, maybe just write, "I'll speak," in your question, and our producer will unmute your microphone so that when I call on you, we can hear you. This has nothing to do with turning on your camera, of course, that will remain off. If you say nothing about speaking, of course, then I will read your question as I always do and represent you in the conversation. This is an experiment. We don't know how it's going to go, but we wanted to try something different. Jorge Cañizares-Esguerra is a historian of the Atlantic world, of science and colonialism, and most broadly of knowledge. His much admired books include How to Write the History of the New World, 2001, Puritan Conquistadors, 2006, and Nature, Empire, and Nation, 2007. He is the Alice Drysdale Sheffield Professor of History at the University of Texas, Austin. Jorge, thanks for joining us again. It's a special pleasure to have you inaugurating a series called Knowledge and Justice in 2020 because of the recent turn in your work. There's really nobody that covers all three of those terms as well as you do. So it's really a delight to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. I appreciate the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start by asking you, first of all, just for the benefit of maybe people who weren't able to join us on Wednesday for your lecture, which, by the way, is posted on our website. You can find a link there if you missed it. But for the benefit of those who weren't there, or maybe just to refresh those who were, if you could just very briefly summarize the argument of that lecture.
Yes, it's a lecture that is part of a book, a much larger project on petitioning in the Spanish Empire, and the title is the Radical Spanish Empire, in which we try to make a larger argument about the participation from the bottom up in the creation of two things. First of all, a Spanish America from 1520s to 1570s that is very much fluid, that witnesses a lot of upward and downward social mobility through the manipulation of paperwork and local archives. And we see a society in which no faction, it's a society of factions, but in which no faction is protected ultimately from the manipulation of paperwork by rivals. And there are many rivals for any party. You can have dozens of rivals within the party, conquistadors or others, friars, bishops, accountants of the king, viceroys, inquisitors, caciques, commoners, you name it, everybody is kind of participating. Now, by 1570s, we argue, there is a major transformation of that society because archives begin to make the disputation among parties a little bit more rigid. The rules of the game begin to change. It doesn't mean that there is not upward or downward social mobility. There is a lot of it, but those who have the upper hand are those who know how the system works, namely access to patronage to the centers of power, be them viceroys, bishops, or inquisitors locally, or the Council of Indies in Madrid, that have archives of their own, and they can kind of regulate, not regulate, they are aware of who has petitioned, what laws have been issued, what cédulas of gracia and gobierno have been issued, and so on and so forth. So they can participate, they cannot be, no longer be manipulated. The crown was easily manipulated by the petitioning of individuals, and the crown had no knowledge whatsoever of what had been issued, since there were about 500,000 cédulas or just by the crown, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of ordenanzas and mandamientos by the local viceroys. So our point is, by the end of the period, a new ancien regime is created, in which those who have cash essentially can purchase archives from those who are downwardly mobile, be them caciques or be them conquistadors or whoever, create their own archives, access patronage, and those three things, cash, patronage, and archives, maintain lineages. If you lack any of those three, you most likely will be challenged and will be put out of business, no matter how prestigious your lineage is. You can be a Moctezuma, but if you lack cash, your archive is likely to go to an Otomi commoner, and you'll be done. So essentially, this new form of ancien regime that is very unlike anything that ever emerged in Europe, that is not necessarily tied to social racial states, and in which commoners, through the centrality of the cash economy of the New World, associated with silver, but also with piracy and the need to compete with rival empires, made it a demand of the crown to access that cash and therefore promote through gracia and rewards those who had that cash. That is essentially the argument.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking now about people watching who might be, younger people who are, students or graduate students who are in Latin American history, who might want to hear you say a little more to situate this project in the wider field. What is this argument? What is it overturning? What are the understandings of the past that you're in a conversation with here?
Yes, it overturns a number of ideas we have about the mature colonial system and also the conquest itself and social mobility and who are the winners and who are the losers of conquest and the creation of that mature ancien regime that we call mature colonial regime prior to the Bourbon reforms of the mid-18th century. So we're talking about 1600 to 1750 essentially. And what came before. And we are saying the views we have about the region follow these British model that I described at the beginning of our discussion last time, that is very much embodied in works like John Eliot's comparative study of the two empires, British and Spanish, in which the British always comes on top in terms of a democratic regime, with religious plurality, and Spanish America is kind of a distuttering and kind of authoritarian regime lacking in democratic participation and all the traditional stereotypes and shibboleths that accompany that British Whiggish model.
Mm-hmm.
And our attempt is to undermine that model, to show that the British never witnessed anything even close to the degree of participation from the bottom up that the Spanish American Empire witnessed. So much for the British democracy. And so too for participation of many different individuals, not only commoners, of European descent, but also commoners from indigenous descent that establish lineages of their own through these forms of mobility. We don't discuss this clearly in the book, but by the end of the book, we address the issue of the rise also of a Black class, military class, that through the rise of piracy and the economy of cash, begin to become also vassals of the king through petitioning and so on and so forth. So by the end of the book, we show that these racial states do not count as much as the historiography had us believe. So it's very much a challenge to these textbook descriptions of both post-conquest 16th century and mature colonial society that is called Baroque. So yeah, it's a very, very aggressive challenge to the historiography, not only of Spanish American Empire, but historiography of early modernity, period,
Mm-hmm.
European
Mm-hmm.
and Atlantic.
And comparative colonialisms as embodied by people like J.H. Eliot, right? In so many books.
Exactly.
Empires of the Atlantic world and books like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge to that regime of knowledge that it's presented Latin America as a failed society by and large, always carrying these colonial legacies on, the burdens of colonial legacies forever, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So on Wednesday, when we were finishing, we had a question from the audience that I said we would postpone until today. And so let me ask it now, because it is germane both to Wednesday's topic and also to what we're talking about today. And this is the way the questioner phrased it. What can the radicals of the present learn from the radical paper pushers of the 16th century?
And my answer at the time was a lot. I would I see myself as a radical paper pusher of the present. I am a historian, and I think my career has been, for the time I've been here in the United States, 33 years, first in graduate school and then teaching. It's been a struggle over narratives that float around, that I hear, that I listen, that my colleagues bandied about, that are dominant, and that are very problematic, that were always problematic to me. And so I began in graduate school, and when I came to the United States, after having fought a war in Colombia and then experiencing exile for 12 years in this country. I went to Wisconsin, Madison, serendipity. My brother was there, and I applied to history of science. I had a medical degree, and I was accepted with no funding, and I was an individual who had I didn't know any English. I came to this country without a word of English. And I had to master the language, and I put myself through graduate school by cleaning toilets without any financial support from the university. And I kept on hearing all these narratives by radical scholars who had no freaking idea who I was, that my interests were actually elite interests because I was interested in ideas. I wasn't doing peasantries and revolution. So the Latin Americanists looked down upon me. I was a useless Latin Americanist. And the historians of science had no use for me either. I wasn't doing Darwin, I wasn't doing Freud, I wasn't doing all that crap. I was doing ideas in the Enlightenment among Jesuits and Creoles in Spanish America. So out of this lack of interest and this absolute marginalization, both by Latin Americanists and by historians of science of whatever I was doing, comes how to write the history of the New World. How to write the history of the world is a big FU to Latin Americanists and historians of science.
It's, by the way, a book that I have used many times in graduate seminars with, and always makes a big impact with graduate students.
Yes, it was meant to be a fuck you to Latin Americanists in Madison and historians of science. And so it's a rereading of the Enlightenment, very radical. Very aggressive, and it shows that learning is somewhere else. It's not necessarily in Paris. Well, there is a lot of learning in Paris and Berlin and all those places that are creating conjectural histories of knowledge, kind of rejecting as untrustworthy indigenous sources and Creole and indigenous written documents and Spanish chronicles as completely untrustworthy as part of this critique of anything that is written biblical. And so they came up with all sorts of alternative conjectural histories. And so that is the rise of the Enlightenment, new readings of America, but that is promptly and quickly rejected epistemologically and philosophically, both in Spain and in Spanish America. So the book is about the Enlightenment in these places that is very much aware of the epistemological foundations of the Enlightenment. This is not simply a mimicking, copying, mindless imitation of European fashions. On the contrary, it's taking on the European knowledge seriously and actually destroying it from within, showing how parochial it was. And that was delicious because I identified myself with those very Creole exiles in Italy who were kind of mocking the great enlightened figures of the 18th century, Rousseau and Voltaire and Buffon and Defoe, et cetera, by going beyond simply controversy, saying, well, America, it's better than Europe. No, it was a problem of epistemology. Whose authority, whose knowledge, whose sources, whose credibility, and that is what the book is about. And it's simply projecting my own experience in Wisconsin onto the past, to be honest, which is history. History is a projection of your own questions onto the past. And I was honestly and openly, and always been openly and honestly political.
And I must have first encountered you. I don't know when I first met you, but I first encountered you around the time that How to Write the History of the New World came out. And it was, in my experience, as somebody who is in comparative literature and is interested in colonial Latin America, among other things, and tries to take a kind of comparative perspective, I thought that book was like a thunderclap. It was so different from anything in your field. You have several fields, but in the colonial Latin American field that I had ever encountered before, that it made a huge difference for me. What was the reception of that project?
It was great. It was, I mean, I have to admit, I mean, I wasn't expecting that reception. It was great. I might have been bitter when I was writing it, but when it came out, it was a great reception. It won prizes. It allowed me to move out of Illinois State, the kind of second-tier university, went to SUNY Buffalo, got tenure, and then eventually wound up in University of Texas at Austin, where I was invited with a very prestigious recruiting fellowship first. And then it became a professorship. I became full professor at a tender age, not just with the book. By then, the Puritan Conquistadors had already come out. Mm-hmm. So I got this offer as part of the success of How to Write the History of the New World. So I have to admit that I wasn't expecting such wide readership. Stanford's made some money out of the book. I think it's published about 6,000 paperback. I mean, it sold 6,000 paperback so far, so it's not bad.
Yeah. So okay. So back to you're speaking to the radicals of the present. Tell me about what they need, what they can learn from these early modern paper pushers.
Well, I mean, what is interesting about these paper pushers is that they have realities of their own, regardless of whatever historians in academia today think about them. They just had realities of their own and worked on their own stuff, and there was mobility of this or the other kind, and it happened independently of historiographical models. And I think that is true of Latin America today as well. I mean, regardless of historiographical models, the societies keep on moving and changing and shifting, and they refuse to follow these expectations that historians and political scientists and sociologists that put onto them. Societies that are corrupt and violent and kind of built on nepotism and failure and colonial legacies, they keep these societies keep proving these models wrong day in and day out. So for me, the lesson is that we cannot settle with, we cannot just abide by these great models that come from either Latin American academia that is being shaped profoundly by British and Anglo-American models of democracy and liberalism, and from also Anglo-American models of democracy and liberalism, and the origins of modernity, the print culture and public sphere, and all the things that are so Enlightenment and all the things that are associated with that model of modernity that to me are profoundly are expressions, yet more expressions of white supremacy as we speak, because they tend to silence alternative historical processes that do not fall into these categories, do not just follow these categories that work as prisons. They silence entire chapters of human history. And the case of our radical Spanish Empire is one case in point. Mm-hmm. These things are simply difficult to conceptualize. They're invisible because they cannot be conceptualized with the categories we have. So they pass unnoticed. So we need to develop categories that can break away from whatever it's been, it's dominant, whatever the models are, that are usually models that tend to present Anglo-American democracy and plurality as exceptional, and so on and so forth. And mm-hmm. The South, the global South, as kind of pathological failures.
We have a comment from somebody who happens to be one of my graduate students here at Stanford, who is a fellow at the Humanities Center this year, writing a dissertation with us. And I'll just read the comment, and then that comment provokes me to ask you a question. The comment is, this book, presumably How to Write the History of the New World, got me deeply interested in the early modern period when I was an undergraduate studying history in Brazil. It was and still is inspiring for me. Now, Jorge, you are a very well-known mentor of graduate students, and you, as I mentioned on Wednesday when I introduced you, a couple of years ago, you received the award from the American Historical Association for mentorship because your graduate students have done so well over these years. What do you say to a graduate student or even an undergraduate, but let's focus on a graduate student. What do you say to a graduate student who is, who sees, as you did when you were in Wisconsin, this big edifice of interpretation that has been imposed on these materials by the conventional view that you've described and that you're working against? And, I would imagine that a lot of PhD students would say, well, even the book, your first monograph, How to Write, that book, it's unconventional as a first monograph, and not everybody is necessarily in a position to hurl themselves against that edifice as you're willing to do. What would you tell a graduate student who wants to participate in bringing down that edifice? What do you tell your students to do? How do you give them the license and tell them what scope of project would work best and where to find their materials and all of the, I'd love to hear something about the kind of advice you give them.
Well, I give them one advice: get a good advisor.
Okay, well, all right. So then they've got you, then what do they do next?
Talk to me. Let's engage in conversations. Let's make this fun. Let's talk to each other. Let me push you and push me. You push me as well. Push back. Let's push each other as much as we can in the pursuit of alternative models of whatever is it you are thinking about. You need a question. That is my first advice, and the question needs to be significant. And I ask them, so what? So what? If you are not able to engage your grandmother with your question, you are probably not doing well. So the significance of the question, why does it matter? It needs to speak at a larger audience, not only to you and your antiquarian concerns. So that is the first big issue, the nature of the question. Is it big? Is it significant? Are you able to answer quickly the so what of that question or not? And if you are not, if you kind of get trapped in all these details, secondary details, and you cannot do the 2-minute elevator spiel, you're probably not going to do well. So we hone that, I do hone with my students that ability to kind of get to the core of an argument quickly and effectively. But it has to be a conversation with each other, but also with the field. So I invite them to kind of open up, be bold, think of themselves as intellectuals, think of themselves as individuals who that can think big. As I was able to think big, even though I was cleaning latrines, as I was able to think big, even though I did not have the language to do it. I was a child for many years, unable to articulate ideas because I didn't have the language, I didn't have the English. But I knew that if I was able to express myself, I would eventually say a few things that were articulate and clear. So I don't give up on anyone because I was one of them. Inarticulate, I was one of them. Humble, I was one of them. Poor, I was one of them. Powerless, I was one of them. Speechless, and I was one of them without a word. And so I know what is it to be there. And so I encourage them not to think that they are incapable of speaking. They are incapable of articulating great ideas, and there has been no one that is proving me wrong, that they can do it, they can pull it off if they have the community. And I like to create communities with my graduate students. It's about community, it's about communication, not only between them and me, between each other, and engage in conversations all the time. So I try to hold seminars with them. I try to open up my graduate seminars to other people outside, and invite people to speak to my graduate students, and invite all graduate students, not only my own, into these conversations. And I think that is crucial, this ongoing conversation with others, asking each other important questions about their own fields, and challenging one another. I think that would be the most important advice I have for graduate students.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. Could you speak some more about how the dismantling of these models of historiography could impact the current contingency that we find ourselves in? In other words, what Black and Brown Lives Matter are trying to accomplish? What's the connection? How do you draw the connection between your historiographical the challenge to historiography that you're mounting and present day political movements?
That is a tough one. That is a tough one. For me, and this is personal, I think that the Black Lives Matter is central to the politics of this country, to the politics of the continent as a whole, because Black Lives matter in the continent, not only in the United States, and should matter everywhere. And so it's a mounting challenge, but that mounting challenge also needs to acknowledge the great variety of histories in this continent and different experiences of citizenship in this hemisphere. And I think Black Lives Matter is forgetting those alternative histories of citizenship in this continent, particularly in the South, in the global South. And as I tell my students, the first Black president of this hemisphere was not Obama, it was Vicente Guerrero in Mexico in 1829. And the first movement that transformed the Constitution created new notions of citizenship that dissolved categories of, that detached racial labeling and racial rights from citizenship, began in places like Chilpancingo in Mexico in 1813 with Morelos, and with the plan of the Tres Garantías of Iguala in 1820 with the militias, Pardo militias of Vicente Guerrero. That these experiences of citizenship that come from the bottom up of the global South, in Mexico in particular, but other places in Latin America, have a lot to teach this country today. Because Latin America did not have to wait up until 1965 and the Civil Rights Act for Blacks and Indians to be citizens. It was a protracted fight, obviously. It wasn't easy. There is no teleology and direction to the arrow of history. There are back and forths and these myth of progress, which things kind of always go in just one direction, is false, as we know now with Trump and everything that's happening in this country. And we know that with Reconstruction as well, after Civil War in this country. I mean, after the Civil War, you have Reconstruction, then you have Jim Crow, which is going back in terms of rights of citizenship for African Americans. in this country. But my point is that there is this other history in the hemisphere of citizenship that is being forgotten, that we need to recover for Black Lives Matter, which is not only a thing of this country, it's a thing of the hemisphere.
And what I hear you saying is that in this present moment of a crisis for justice that we hope turns out to be an opportunity for justice, that something like graduate study in history is not a retreat from that, but is in fact, can be an opportunity for someone who wants to make a difference to charge right into that area.
Oh, definitely. And I think the history of Latinx in this country needs some reflection and some revisiting as part of this Black Lives Matter movement as well. Yeah. In that the experience of Latinx, Hispanics in this country is not unlike the experience of African Americans in this country. And so in the 19th century, you have the same, essentially similar patterns and paradoxes. In the case of Hispanics with 1836 and the takeover of Texas by Anglo-American slaveholders, what you begin to see is that this history of citizenship of Mexico begins to disappear, begins to evaporate from the memory of this nation. We know that the Alamo is a fight over emancipation. It's the first battle of the Civil War in this country. It's not about freedom, Tejano freedom versus Mexican centralism and absolutism. It's about emancipation and slavery, the fact that the Pardo militias of both Guerrero and Santana, coming from Veracruz and Acapulco, the coast of Pacific and the coast of the Atlantic, are fighting a war of emancipation in Texas. And that is what the Battle of Alamo and the Battle of Texas is about. Houston wins over Santana and slavery wins. But the project of these armies was to emancipate, to eliminate slavery, because the Constitution of Mexico had eliminated slavery centrally. It no longer was the right of any federal state to have slaves. So Coahuila lost the right to have slaves in the province of Texas. So that transform Mexicanos. Mexicanos remain Mexicanos in the Southwest. That is, remain foreigners, just like free Blacks remain foreigners in the 19th century in this country. They were seen as Africans, and they, by and large, saw themselves as Africans because they were not welcome. The Constitution of Texas of 1841, the principle of the Constitution of Texas of 1841 is that you are free and emancipated Black, you have to leave the darn state. There is no room for free Blacks in Texas. There is antithetical, the notion of Black citizenship and citizenship. You need to leave the state. And so Lincoln sees the problem of emancipation in very similar terms. I mean, free Blacks need to leave the heck out of the United States. They go to Liberia or go to Panama or whatever it is. These white supremacists considered they needed to go. But African Americans kind of began to settle the issue of citizenship with Reconstruction. Mexican Americans did not. Mexicanos did not settle the issue of citizenship until 1954. Mm-hmm. And this is worth remembering with Hernandez v. Texas. 1954, when Mexicanos, for the first time, I consider to be Mexican Americans. By SCOTUS, by the Supreme Court, they have the right to participate in juries for the first freaking time. From 1836 to 1954, all Mexicanos, regardless of the fact that they were born in San Antonio or in Austin or in whatever, Amarillo, they did not have the right to participate in juries. And that pattern still remains in this country. Even though Mexican Americans have been central to the construction of this nation from the very beginning, and that is what my Puritan Conquistadors is about. Mm-hmm. I mean, demonstrating the Iberian roots, theologically, ideologically, socially, of the colonization of the Northeast, the Puritan Northeast. So this experience, this Mexican-American experience, is not one experience of minorities. It's an experience that is central to the construction of this nation, as the experience of African Americans is central to the construction of this nation, not as minorities, but constitutionally in the very creation of foundations of this nation. And that narrative, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is being very, very successful at challenging this narrative that African Americans were kind of at the margins of the making of the history of 19th century liberalism and capitalism and so forth. That without African Americans, there is no 19th century capitalism, globalization. There is no America, period. And the same applies for issues of rights and citizenship. Without African Americans, you cannot understand the history of citizenship, white citizenship, without African Americans. Well, my point is that is also true of Latinx and Hispanics, that they are central to the constitution of this nation from the very freaking beginning, and yet they remain marginal in most narratives as minorities, kind of in studies for things Hispanic. So you have centers for things Hispanic here, centers for things Latino there, and that is where you study Latino things, and that is when you concentrate all the Latinx and Hispanics on campus. That is their place to do things Hispanic. And everywhere else, they are absent, which is the case of the University of Texas, which is amazing. 250 centers of research, none of them led by Hispanics, unless they are centers on things Hispanics. So you cannot do astrophysics and be Hispanics and be a director of Center of Astrophysics. You cannot be Hispanic and be director of, Quantum Mechanics Center. If you are Hispanic, you do things Hispanic. So notice how perverse and grotesque that thing is. And even in things that are Hispanic, you have individuals, you have a structure of power that makes it impossible for those individuals to be in positions of power.
So this is a good moment.
The center of Latin America. Mm-hmm. Now, I just wanted to say that one of the striking things about the University of Texas at Austin is that we identify the fact that we have the foremost center of Latin American studies and Latino studies in the world that is called Lilas Benson, right? That was founded 80 years ago. And in 80 years, not a single Latino or Latin American has been a director until recently, in the wake of our Hispanic Equity Report.
The Long Institute of Latin American Studies, right? Lilas,
yes.
Right? Yeah, right.
Lilas, yes. Can you imagine the foremost center of African American studies in this country, never led by an African American, never, always by whites, females or males? That would be a scandal. That would have been unprecedented. Here in the University of Texas, there was an outcry because we called that out and said, how is it possible that you are saying that? That is an insult to the institution. No, it's not an insult. The insult is that there were Latinos and Latin Americans have never been in charge of that center. That is what is insulting.
So how did tell us, take a step back and tell us how this project of what we might call institutional justice originated. Was it your observations about these kinds of disparities and these anomalies? Was it was there a group of you that were started to talk about this? Was it, what was the origin of it?
That's a good question. It's a combination of things. I think it's the perception on my part that there were things that would seem to be unfair with junior faculty of Hispanic descent on campus. In our department in particular, there was a pattern of giving tenure to folks. We had a record of until recently of 14 candidates went up for tenure and 10 were rejected.
Hmm.
So there was a process in which it seems like the university bring in individuals who were rising stars, and by the end of the 7 years, is issuing failed professionals. And that was particularly striking when it comes to Hispanics, because in the University of Texas, we identified the fact that 6 of every 10 Latinos that are brought to University of Texas leave within 7 years as failed professionals, either because they didn't get tenure or because they just quit. That is remarkable, because the record of success of tenure for any other racial group is 80%. In the case of Hispanics, 40%. So there is something freakingly wrong. And so it began with that sense of grievance on my part that began to grow with a critique to the department. There were other Hispanics in my department that joined in, but they had been complaining for a long time. The difference is that their voices didn't count before. They were not part of the in-group. I was one of the beneficiaries of nepotism for a long time in the university. I had outside offers and I had all sorts of goodies given to me, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very odd that somebody who had benefited from nepotism in the university would all of a sudden begin to turn against this model. And that was very upsetting and began to create a lot of unrest in the department. And that gave an opening to those individuals who were truly marginalized. I wasn't marginalized. I never was marginalized. My colleagues were very generous, always with me. I got 2 partners who got out. I married once, and my first wife got a tenure track position. I married second time, and my second wife got an outside, also a tenure track position. That is unheard of. So I am the beneficiary of a system that wasn't as generous with most people. And yet, those who were really marginalized, they did not have the opportunity to speak up. And I, by speaking up myself, gave these individuals the opportunity to really begin to speak up. And then we created this thing called the the Independent Equity Committee, led by somebody whose name needs to be recognized, Alberto Martinez. Alberto Martinez is the force behind the Hispanic Equity Report by far. He is the person who accumulated all the data with precision, with a work ethic that is unparalleled. I mean, I thought I was an individual who worked a lot and very hard and obsessed with discipline in my labor, but I've never seen somebody who's worked as hard as Alberto Martinez. And Alberto Martinez put together most of the data that went into that Hispanic Equity Report.
How did he go about it? What did he, and what kind of institutional support or institutional resistance was there?
Oh, there was only institutional resistance, not support. There was none. To this day, we cannot access data on salaries. There is this decision on the part of the administration that is not public data, when in fact it is. But fortunately for us, there was data on salaries by the Texas Tribune, a newspaper that made salaries of all government institutions in Texas public. And up until recently, it had both annual salaries and total compensation, which are not the same thing, by the way. Mm-hmm. Annual salary and total compensation are not the same thing. Annual salary is something that appears on the books as your salary, but annual compensation can be $200,000 more dollars than your annual salary, because these are arrangements between individuals who are very powerful, deans and provosts and chairs, that kind of strike deals with individuals on the side. That is part of the structure of nepotism. So those who have social capital can benefit from it. Those who have authority, those whose are worthy of consideration and merit are the ones who have access to all those resources that are kept by very few individuals that are brokers of power. So our deans and our chairs and our provosts are really small queens and kings that are, there is no accountability. They have these massive amount of resources that they can dish out to individuals at will without any transparency and accountability. And that is what the Hispanic Equity Report makes clear. There is no transparency and there is no accountability of all these brokers of power. And structures of power are basically based on social capital. Those who have social capital do well. Those who do not have social capital are screwed. And those who have little social capital happen to be by and large Hispanics. And that is the big message that the Hispanic Equity Report shows. Fortunately, because the Hispanic Equity Report is so massive and so detailed and so elegant in its structure, that the university could do nothing but to just be ashamed and be silent and listen to a massive outcry on the part of public opinion. So the periodicals of record of Austin and Houston came up with editorials by the editorial page, by the editorial board, saying the university needs to do something because this is outrageous. And the Hispanic caucus of the Texas House of Representatives began to put pressure on the university. What the heck is going on? And things are beginning to change. And there have been big changes, by the way, since October 8, 2019. The university was so caught on guard by these data that they had no choice but to begin to introduce changes. And they are introducing changes. A little, it's not as willingly as they should, but they have to, they have no choice.
Did they know it was coming? Did you and your collaborators do this quietly, or did you?
No, they didn't do, no, nobody saw it coming. No, we did it quietly, and we did it, it began in the history department as a movement of 3 senior Hispanic professors in history that began to recruit others in other departments, sociology, anthropology, psychology, English, and it grew into this study of many other departments on campus, but essentially in the College of Liberal Arts. We began to introduce other colleges. We began to study patterns of endowments. Who has endowments in the university? I mean, for instance, in my case, I am an endowed professor, right? My department has 10 endowed chairs. I have an endowed professorship. I am not good enough to have an endowed chair in the University of Texas. To this day, I'm not good enough. No matter how much I've published, no matter how my merits are, I have yet to be considered to that position of great prestige, which is the endowed chair. Fortunately, our demands and our denunciations of how these patterns of creating endowments and giving endowments to the friends of the friends and the friends of friends and the friends of more friends, without any transparency and accountability is changed. Now the College of Liberal Arts has introduced a policy about how those endowments need to be administered, and who has, whether individuals who are not, who have not the benefit of social networking can participate openly and transparently in that competition over endowments. And that is true also of endowed professorships, and it's also true of fellowships of endowments, because the university has these large amounts of money of unfulfilled chairs that are distributed by chairs at will without little transparency and accountability. So if I am your friend, I give you the fellowship. You are my enemy, I don't give you anything. Regardless of whether you merit it or not, there is no way of knowing. The same for teaching awards. We demonstrate patterns of, oh yeah, teaching awards. It's the same, it's the same as scratching each other's backs. So you have individuals. I mean, who knows whether I am a good teacher or not? I think I am an amazing teacher, but I mean, am I considered to be an amazing teacher? No, I mean, it depends on the decisions that are done by a few individuals nominate each other in these committees, and they begin to reward each other. And so you have individuals who have 10, 15, 20 awards, and you have Hispanics, and we have that record that rarely in 50 or 60 or 80 years of documentation of these awards have won awards. So there was a pattern of discrimination even there, because it's all about social capital. And if you don't have that social capital, you have no access to those rewards. And so that is a challenge as well. The systems of rewards, of merit, of identifying merit on teaching need to change. In the same way that we have new policies on endowments that are transparent, that seek transparency. We have to make sure that that is really the case. We are kind of submitting, independent equity committee is submitting a revised version of the College of Liberal Arts document on endowments. We are pointing out a number of very problematic issues with the document by the dean, and so hopefully the dean will introduce changes. In any event, all this stuff needs to change and needed to be questioned, and is changing. Issues of numbers, for instance, numbers of faculty on campus. This is the University of Texas in Texas, where 48% of the high school population are Hispanics, people of Hispanic descent, 48% of the high school population, and there's 6% of faculty in the University of Texas who are Hispanics. Now, most of that population is concentrated in College of Liberal Arts, and most of that population is concentrated in centers that do things Hispanic, Spanish and Portuguese, Center of Mexican Studies, the Department of Mexican Studies, and so on and so forth. We want Hispanics to be everywhere, to be in geophysics, and to be in mathematics, and to be in astrophysics, and to be anywhere and everywhere. But the department, the institution, we demonstrate, had an absence of Hispanics in about 80% of its centers, institutions, colleges, and schools. There were schools like the law school that had I'm trying to remember, about 200 faculty in law. I might be wrong, 240, had 2 Hispanics. The Center of Policy Making in the university, the Lyndon Johnson B. School
the
of
LBJ
Policy,
school, yeah.
LBJ had 1 Hispanic. So can you imagine a center, a university that had only 1 Latina in the entire school? And there were other cases. I mean, from engineering to natural sciences, etc., they were absolutely absent with a few exceptions.
Now, these are facts about a university that, every university knows and sometimes is obliged to disclose percentages of faculty, percentages of students in various categories. So surely they knew all of these things. Your report could not be bringing them on this question of the composition of the faculty. Surely your report was not bringing them news that they had never heard before.
Not at all. Let me show you this because it's very telling. I'm looking for my, and I forgot, where is it? Sorry, for some reason it's not here. I'm gonna bring it up if you give me a second.
Yeah, take your time.
The EC nominations, okay, there you go. Okay, so let me now go to share screen. And if you go to share screen, you find this thing, and I cannot, for some reason, I cannot find the picture. iPhone, iPad, equity. Well, there is a sorry, photos. Is these photos, files, advanced? Cannot find my photograph, but this is about, is this one? No, sorry. Can you see that now? No? Can you see on screen? No, the image? No. Let me try again. Sorry, let me try again. Okay. This is a document that came from the university. They had documented, here it is. This is not that data we had. This is data the university had. I don't know whether you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a document we produced in order to demand the university to address the issue of equity with faculty of Hispanic descent. But here is data that the university had for since 2010 to 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, faculty salary differences controlling for fields and experience, full professors, campus-wide, horizontal line, non-Hispanic-wide. This is for women, 2010, 2018. This is data the university had. So it begins with 1.7 difference in 2010, drops to 25% in 2013, and goes up slowly to 13 and 11% difference. So women in the university who were Latinas full professors were paid on average 11% or 12% less than anybody else, regardless of their accomplishments.
Mm-hmm.
And this is for men as well. This is data the university have. You can see that things get worse over time, not better. And these are men. In 2009, the university, the average difference of salary was 2.7. By 2015, it went to 13 or almost 14% difference from the rest of the university. This is data the university had. So they knew and did nothing. And so that is what is so remarkable about it.
So was the impact then of the report that you put it all together in one place and they could see the pattern across so many different schools and affecting so many different individuals that they had sort of kept in separate categories in their minds? How what was the...
Well, I mean, it has to do with something that Alberto Martinez conceptualized, and I think very accurately, it's a term that he coined that is called Hispanopia, which is the inability to see things Hispanic in a polarized society of white and black. The issues of race in this country are such that you can see issues of discrimination with African Americans, clearly, but when it comes with Hispanics, you can see them only when it happens in the border, not when it happens to your neighbor right next to your office. So you can see concentration camps. Liberals can see concentration camps on the border, Ciudad Juarez, whatever, but they cannot see discrimination right next to them in their offices on campus. When it comes to Hispanics, for some reason, Hispanics are invisible. And the question is why they are invisible. And there are many, many reasons why they are invisible, but I think it has to do with this tradition of considering everything and anything Hispanic foreigner, Mexicano, to begin with. I mean, so they are DACA, they are illegals, they are undocumented, they are this, they are the other. And also the fear of political mobilization of many of these populations that are not, whose families are always kind of, legal papers are always pending. So you have this fear on the part of populations like in Austin, et cetera, of engaging politically, of speaking up, of being an activist, because they are always on the border or borderland of citizenship and rights. They lack rights. They are not citizens. They are always on this boundary of non-citizenship and therefore no rights and therefore no voice.
So this morning on social media, I saw you posted a rather stunning list of some of the results of the Hispanic Equity Report. Could you tell us about those?
Yes. Alberto Martinez sent me an email this morning and said, Jorge, you are always very negative, and the title of your talk is wrong. He said, from marginality to more marginality. And that is not accurate, Jorge, because things are changing and we have accomplished great things in a matter of a year. And you need to say so, Jorge, because it is not just from marginality to more marginality, it's from marginality to less marginality. And I had to agree. And so here is the list, and I am sharing the list. It's a list of 13 things that have happened that he sent to me. The first one is almost 300,000 in equity raises for 21 Hispanic tenure professors, ranging from 13,000 to 40,000 each. A new policy of endowments in COLA that I just described.
COLA is
first
is COLA the College of Liberal Arts?
College of Liberal Arts. Yes. The first non-white chair and associate chair in the history of the department in 132 years. Let me read again. The first non-white chair and associate chair in the history of the department in 132 years. Amazing. And this is true of almost every other department in COLA. If you look at the record of chairs in every department in the College of Liberal Arts, you have the same freaking record as in history. Complete white supremacy. Well, that ended in history. And it ended because, darn, we pushed hard. Fourth, the creation of a Dean's Equity Committee headed by Hispanic deans and with Hispanic faculty as consultants. I am in that committee. Alberto is in that committee. That is a first one. We are dealing with the deans. I, Jorge Cañizares, who's never been the chair of a search committee in my department, in my field, never. I'm not joking. I am in a Dean's Equity Committee headed by Hispanic deans and with Hispanic faculty as consultants. So I gained suddenly, personally, but that is not, I mean, I already had lots of power, but institutionally, I was recognized for the first time to be more than just a good advisor, mentor of graduate students, and period. But as an individual who could set policy and contribute to setting policy on campus. Three new Hispanic faculty in the Executive Committee of Faculty Council, including the chair of the Independent Equity Committee, that is Alberto, and the new chair-elect of Faculty Council. That's suddenly almost doubling in total participation of Hispanics in the Faculty Council Executive Committee in 50 years. We demonstrated that in 50 years of elections, the Faculty Council Executive Committee had 3 Hispanics elected to positions of authority. 3 in 50 years. This is not Alaska, this is not Montana, this is Texas. 6th, the first Hispanic director of LILA since it was created 80 years ago.
That's the Long Institute of Latin American Studies.
Long Institute of Latin American, the first foremost center of Latin American studies, never being directed by a Hispanic in 80 years. Imagine the Center of African American Studies in Harvard, never been directed by an African American director. What a scandal would have that been? It would have been in the first page of the New York Times. 7th, the Dean of the College of Communications, the first Hispanic director. Okay, leadership positions for 3 Hispanics in the School of Architecture. First time. 7th, the Dean of the College of Communications finally converted Voces Oral History Project into a center. Amazing. They have been pleading, begging, finally it became a center. 8th, the first Hispanic woman in the UT's Academy of Distinguished Teachers since it was created 25 years ago. This is the teaching awards thing. That is, you scratch each other's back. Hispanics had ever been in that freaking academy, and particularly women, until last year. It was so shameful, and the institution was so ashamed and so caught off guard that they had to do something. So there is a Hispanic token now. 9, the promotion of 2 Hispanic women to roles of assistant dean. There were 0. There were no assistant deans, associate deans, and deans who were Latinas on campus, period, none. Now there are 2. 9, the promotion of 10, the creation of the Equity Task Force in the Hispanic Faculty and Staff Association. Staff are beginning to organize. It's not only faculty, and hopefully students too. 11th, the public statement that UT aims to become a Hispanic serving institution. This is amazing. This is the University of Texas that is probably the only university in the state of Texas that is not a Hispanic serving institution, that is, it has not 25% threshold of Hispanics as students, which is remarkable. And the reason why they don't have it is because they have this holistic thing. There is the law of 10% or 7% low admission that makes it a requirement for the top 6% graduates of any high school to be admitted to the University of Texas. And that yields about 30% Hispanics, 30% Hispanics. Listen to me. And this was one of the reasons why the University of Texas went to the Supreme Court. Now, there is the holistic admission process. And the University of Texas argued before the Supreme Court that the holistic admission process is about incorporating minorities, affirmative action. Well, it's not. It's affirmative action for whites. Holistic admission process brings down the number of Hispanics from 30% to 23, 22. So the whole argument before the Supreme Court is a sham. Now they have to deal with that, and they are beginning to recognize that it's a political problem. 11th or 12th, the recruitment of multiple new Hispanic faculty campus-wide. That is true. We have a new Hispanic woman who was recruited in our department this year as an associate professor. 13, multiple interventions of Texas representatives and senators to inquire at the president's office regarding equity for Hispanic professors, as recently as last week, Senator Menendez. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of pressure on the university to really do something and reform, and I think it's about time. So this is the list.
Yeah, thank you for this. It's great to see so many very concrete results. Where do you think this is going to be in 5 years, 10 years? Do you and your colleagues who were involved in producing this Hispanic Equity Report have a sense of the long-range prospects of this initiative? And how to keep the momentum, I suppose, is what I'm really asking.
That is a very good question. Well, I think the momentum should be in the hands of students now. It should be, we've done our share, we've done our part. Now it's on the hands of activists, students. If anything is going to change on campus, and particularly that issue of Hispanic serving institution and to change patterns of admission of Blacks and Latinx students on campus, gotta come from students from below. They have to really put pressure on the president and the provost. There is nothing that the presidents and provosts fear more than the mobilization of students, the wide mobilization of students. I can speak forever in webinars for hours and nothing is going to happen. But if students on campus, UT, Latinos and Blacks begin to really put pressure on the administration to change patterns of admission and to do away with the holistic admission process and just get students through the 7 or 6% rule that would bring the numbers of both Blacks, African Americans, and Hispanics up, that'll be a big change. They'll put an end to all these nepotism that happens under the table with the very fashionable term of holistic admissions. again, I think that is the path forward.
Are there signs that the students are mobilizing around these questions? Or
No, there isn't, as far as I can tell. I've been a little bit absent lately for personal reasons, but I don't think there isn't much mobilization. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, it's also put a freeze on the mobilization of Latinx students. My own department created a category of BIPOC to define people of color in the department, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Therefore, kind of render yet again invisible, the category of Latinx from the mix. And which is curious because the history department in the foremost program on Latin American history in the world that decided to render invisible alternative narratives of citizenship in the hemisphere. And that is what the category Latino means. It comes from the 19th century, which is the struggle to get rid of racial labeling in the construction of citizenship in the continent. That is what Latino means. Latin American meant from the very beginning in the early 19th century, in the mid 19th century, and in the struggles to battle white supremacy, white American supremacy in the Southwest, and particularly in the Caribbean, and particularly in Central America. That is what it meant. And yet, this tradition of alternative citizenship that it's embedded in the category Latin or Latino, it's forgotten in the history department of all places. So the history department can afford to do away with silence an alternative history of citizenship in the continent without any pushback, and so all Latino students went silent and said, okay, well, whatever, because it was confused with, well, oh, it's white lives matter as well. That is what these guys are saying. And so people rather be quiet instead of being associated with white lives matter. Again, this is about Black Lives Matters, and Latinos are Black as well. And there are hundreds of thousands of, the great majority of Blacks in the continent went to Latin America, not to the United States. There were more Mexicans, Africans in Mexico together than the total amount of Africans that arrived in the United States, continental United States. And that is something that probably your audience has no idea. So Mexico is more African than the United States was. And in the 19th century, slavery is not African, it's African-American slavery. It's slaves from Virginia on the East Coast that are being mobilized to Mississippi Cotton Kingdom. They are not Africans, they are African-Americans, or Americans, citizens, or well, denied citizenship as slaves. So what I'm trying to say is that if there is experience of Blackness in the continent, that is the experience of Latin America and Latinx. That experience needs to be at the very forefront of any discussion of Black Lives Matter in the hemisphere and in this country as well.
So we just have 10 minutes, about 10 minutes or a little bit less left in our conversation. What advice would you give to anyone? I'm thinking faculty, graduate students, undergraduates, staff in institutions of higher education who might aspire to do something like what you did at UT?
Organize, and speak up, and don't be afraid, and make alliances, and it's not easy. I have to acknowledge, emotionally it took a toll. It was hell for a couple of years for me. I did not felt supported by even the most intimate members of my household. let alone by colleagues. So it's freaking intense. Emotionally, it's a toll and takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of emotional toll. But be prepared and work hard and organize.
And what do you do for
and organize and speak up?
I mean, UT, despite the dismaying numbers that you were sharing with us, you know, UT and Austin as a place is still a place with a large number of, because it's such a big university, a relatively large number of Hispanic faculty around the university. What do you say to somebody? You must have former graduate students like this who are, you know, the only Latinx faculty member in their department, or maybe in their college, something like that. How do they organize? What do they do? What would you say to somebody who's really isolated?
God, I mean, reach out to people in other campuses. I mean, reach out networks. Create networks. Yeah. It's not gonna be solved or settled within your own institution. You have to reach out and network with other institutions. That would be the first thing I would do. I would make alliances with other groups, particularly African Americans, if possible, because probably their experience is going to be very similar to the experience of Latinx faculty. And if possible, I mean, the ideal representative of these alliances should be Afro-Latinos. And there are hundreds of them, and I think they have a very important responsibility in all this. But yeah, networking outside their own institutions, reaching out to people like us, our committee. I receive constantly information from faculty on campuses that are being discriminated against, who have concerns, who fear about their tenure, who have been marginalized, and so we get this information. Sometimes it's very difficult to know what to do with it, to make it public. We need some kind of repository of these stories that is public, in which people can kind of come and share publicly these stories, perhaps keeping their anonymity, but at least making the stories public. And probably that is something the Independent Equity Committee needs to work on, creating this website that would allow for coordination and pooling of information. But again, these needs to come from grassroots, from students, from undergraduates, that when they mobilize, change is possible, real change is possible. Faculty mobilizing, people like me mobilizing, complaining because I am not powerful enough, it's a joke. People do not pay much attention to what I say. I mean, they say, oh, I feel discriminated against. You gotta be kidding me, Jorge. I mean, discriminated against what? You have power, you have prestige, you have good salary. So this is a joke. So if it comes from undergraduates, it comes from students, it comes from the bottom up, if it comes from staff, if it comes from people who are really powerless, it'll be different. Their voices will count more, and the university will be forced to change and introduce reforms. So it's basically a responsibility of undergraduates now. I would say, if there are any undergraduates out there, the responsibility is yours. We did our best.
Well, Jorge, I want to thank you. I don't know how we could have started this series in any better way than this. You are you're the kind of spokesman for these issues that we need to have, and especially for those of you who were not able to attend the virtual lecture on Wednesday, which you can still find on our website. For me, the interplay between your two appearances in this series, on Wednesday sharing your scholarship, and then today talking about how many of the same tools that go into scholarship can be applied to an institutional context and what the results are. That to me is such a valuable start for this series. I know I'm speaking for everybody in the audience and all the fellows at the Humanities Center and everybody watching when I say thank you so much for starting this off for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And for those of you with us, let me just remind you that if you want to join us next month, October 20th, our next online event will be our annual presidential lecture in the humanities, featuring the philosopher Achille Mbembe, speaking on futures of life, futures of reason. You can find all the details about this event and every other event that we sponsor on our website, shc.stanford.edu. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, audience. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.